Hey guys, before we jump into part 7 of the retrospective, I have to say something I'd really prefer not to. With this series, I've seen a giant influx of attention, and it's been amazing talking about one of my favorite franchises of all time with some like-minded people, but sadly this may have caused a few problems too. YouTube will often flag my videos as advertiser unfriendly, quite literally the second they're done with the upload process, and my luck with appeals looks like it's starting to run out. Now, I know there are ways to sidestep this, but I have two giant issues. First and foremost, I absolutely refuse to let the infantile nature of YouTube dictate what games I cover. Advertisers be damned, I will always review the games I want to, when I want to. And second, I will not treat my viewers like 2-year-olds by curbing my language. I try my hardest to keep these scripts well written and relatively free of foul language, but I will throw in a fuck or shit in there at some point. It may not be the most articulate way to get my point across, but it's how I talk and how I think. The way I look at it is, if I want you guys to respect me, I have to respect you, and that means assuming that the majority of you are able to handle a few crass words. Now don't get me wrong, I understand having ads on my video is a privilege, it really is, but I don't want that to drive what I do here. Which brings us to the main point. This little hobby has become a big part of my income recently, and a loss in ad revenue on only a few videos could do me in at this point. So I want to ask that any of you who appreciate this content and my ability to deliver it every other week, consider supporting me on Patreon. If we're being honest, just $1 a month from less than a quarter of you will be enough to make this a full-time job for me, and make no mistake, I intend to do just that. I want these videos to be even more frequent and hopefully more polished. Now, I know what you're thinking, you probably have much better places to spend your money than on YouTube game analysis videos, and to that I say, well, fair enough. I know I'm not the best at what I do, but I certainly strive to be, and if you're able to help, I think I can get there. Well guys, I appreciate you not immediately skipping past this point, and thank you all for your continued support. If you want to join the list of amazing people scrolling at the bottom of the screen, I'll link my Patreon in the description, and with that, let's get on with the show. Well, it's about damn time I made my way to the most modern entry in the RE series. Resident Evil 7 is seen by many as a return to the franchise roots, a game that harkens back to the slow-building, atmospheric survival horror that made these games such a hit in the public eye. Now, it may have taken me way too long to have finally played 7, but since its release, I've steered clear of any reviews or in-depth discussions on the game, so you're about to get as unbiased an opinion as can be expected from someone who actually considers themselves a fanboy. Is this really the savior of the series? Can this game usher in a new era of survival horror? Well, what's up guys, I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews. Welcome to the Resident Evil Retrospective.
You gotta help me.
After the critical panning and financial success of RE6, Capcom knew two things for sure. They had to make another high-quality Resident Evil game, and the days of copying RE4 had officially come to an end. Or maybe they hadn't? Well, anyways, Capcom knew they needed another game changer if the series was going to keep selling. A game that would be as bold and revolutionary as 4 was in its day. Oddly enough, they started the process with another action-focused idea, but soon the mood shifted to a more closed-off, creepy feel. With this came the idea to switch to a first-person view, an idea that had been dabbled with in RE's past, but never in an overly successful way. The jump back to a more confined environment led the team to focus on the more atmospheric elements of horror, which snowballed into a full-on attempt at recreating the classic-style RE games that we're all used to. My initial reaction to the first-person perspective and gameplay shift was to condemn Capcom for what I saw as copying the trend of making games specifically for Let's Players and streamers to overreact to on the internet, and now that I've played it, I can say I am definitely a huge fan of this decision, although I'm not completely prepared to say it had nothing to do with the popularity of games like Outlast and specifically Konami's PT. Now don't get me wrong, the reasoning is not as important to me as the outcome, and we will definitely be talking about that later, but it just kind of strikes me as odd that in order to bring the world's seminal survival horror series back to its roots, the devs had to draw inspiration from games that were likely inspired by Resident Evil. That just kind of strikes me as weird, but Hey, enough pontificating, let's talk about exactly how the game brings the series back to basics.
I told you to stay out of here!
RE7's story is both something to behold and hard to describe without ruining. The good news is the basic setup is pretty straightforward. Main character Ethan Winters is on his way to Louisiana in the hopes of finding his wife Mia, thanks to a message she sent him. The only catch is, Mia's been presumed dead for the last 3 years.
It's Mia. She's not dead, she's alive. She's back.
After getting to the old plantation Mia directed him to, Ethan finds some kind of insane Texas Chainsaw Massacre situation with a family of psychos taking him hostage. As it turns out, Mia is indeed alive, but maybe not in the exact condition Ethan left her in.
Ethan, it's okay. It's okay, it's me. I know you didn't mean to hurt me.
You shouldn't have done that!
From here, the story takes a few different turns and switches up its approach, but I don't want to ruin any of it since I found this to be the most rewarding part of the game. So instead, let's analyze the small bit of what I am willing to tell you. If my description gave you flashbacks of the second Silent Hill game, then congrats, you're absolutely right. The "my dead wife sent me a message and now I'm following it to a remote part of the US" trope isn't exactly the freshest trick in the book, but this premise does serve the overall narrative. Oddly enough, this comparison is actually valid in more ways than one. If you've only played through the first 5 or 6 hours of 7, you could be forgiven for thinking it was the spiritual SH2 of Resident Evil. The closed-off, secluded nature of the main compound you spend most of your time in doesn't exactly allow for a lot of exposition regarding events outside of your current fight to escape this horror. In this way, it felt like 7 could take place outside of the events of the mainline RE games. So little of the first 2/3 of the game has to do with RE lore, I was convinced that like Silent Hill 2, RE7 was just a spin-off taking place in some undetermined part of the official timeline. Sure, the familiar elements were all here, but they were being applied to what seemed to be a completely unrelated story. For the majority of the game, there's no mention of BOWs, no bioterror, and only the slightest hints at a broader scope of the narrative. All things considered, I thought this was a series reboot, but after the 70% mark, the story opens up along with the explorable environment. After this point, most of the heavy hitters return in all their full glory, and the story shapes up to be a perfect celebration of classic RE. In doing research for this review, I found that a lot of people preferred the first third of the game due to its complete lack of connection to the series at large, but the jarring switch from isolated events to full-on series canon was amazing for me. Now don't get me wrong, I was perfectly happy with my first impressions of the story. I'm not at all against a nice romp through a one-and-done side story, especially one as well made as this, but the surprise I got when concepts like bioorganic test subjects, dirty weapons deals, and anti-terror squads started getting thrown around was exactly what I was looking for. As a fan from the very beginning, I can say this story is Resident Evil through and through. The emphasis on solving the seemingly huge problem of getting out of the Baker estate, and then the widening of scope to involve experimental biotech and human testing works almost right in line with the first game, but stays unique enough to keep from feeling like a cheap retread. And now after replaying it, I'm starting to see the signs of a bigger world were hidden around me from the very beginning. Outside of the story, the characters deserve special mention. The Bakers are given boatloads of personality, and their differing levels of absolute insanity makes them especially terrifying to encounter. At first, I didn't really care too much for Mia's personality for obvious reasons, but towards the end, she gets fleshed out, and I'll be damned if she didn't grow on me. And at this point, I'm gonna do something I've never really done before. I recommend that you play the Not a Hero DLC immediately after finishing the main game. Now, those of you that follow me on social media know I have a policy against paying for DLC, but luckily Not a Hero is free, and it'll definitely answer some throbbing questions you might have after the end of the main game. Okay, so I know I've been incredibly vague here, but trust me, the less you know, the more you'll enjoy it. RE7's story is the absolute best example of all my favorite elements from the old survival horror games, and is 110% worth your time. Don't be fooled by the developers essentially pulling a Metal Gear Solid 2 on us for the first part of the game. The secluded and sectioned off portions of the story eventually gives way to something very familiar and super entertaining. I wish I could tell you more, but trust me when I say this is the best, most well-told story in modern Resident Evil history. If you're an old RE fan, do whatever it takes to experience this glorious celebration of everything you used to love about the series.
We'll be together forever.
Now here's where we get into some very dicey territory. Even though I stayed away from this game and any real media covering it, it's hard to miss the constant cries of RE7 being the game that finally brought the series back to its survival horror roots. Everywhere I looked, there was someone trumpeting the game with something along the lines of, "Suck it bitches, survival horror's back." Well, at the risk of sounding like a contrarian, no, that isn't exactly the case, at least not in my opinion. But before you click out of the video in a fit of rage, I just ask that you hear me out. First things first, let's cover the many faces of RE7's gameplay. The first thing anyone's going to notice is that Resident Evil 7 breaks with core series tradition and opts for a first-person perspective, a move that I heavily criticized at first. Given the industry's love affair with first-person, non-combat, streamer-centric horror games at the time, I saw this as a cheap cash-in, and the very first 30 minutes of the game does very little to argue against that idea. But an hour in, and I was more than happy to admit just how wrong I really was. After the game's insanely climactic and misleading setup, I was blown away at how familiar it felt. Before I knew it, I was backtracking through claustrophobic hallways leading to wide-open central hubs, searching for elaborate keys to unlock new areas to slowly creep around in, all the time just knowing there was going to be some terrifying unnatural beast hiding just out of sight. Seriously, this gameplay is like some kind of Resident Evil greatest hits mashup. The puzzle solving, limited inventory, ammo conservation, punishing combat, and dark oppressive atmosphere have all returned, and it is an absolute joy to say that. But you don't come to this channel for broad strokes, so let's get specific. Essentially, 7 takes the award-winning formula from RE1 and implements it into a first-person horror game. You start out with a very small portion of the Baker home to explore, but eventually make your way to a central area that will open up the rest of the house, with the right keys of course. Fans of parts 1 and 2 are likely getting flashbacks in this area, and for good reason. 7 works exactly like its forefathers where exploration is concerned. With only a few exceptions, each newly opened door in the main house opens up a fairly confined but deceptively large area that snakes in on itself. Imagine the first Resident Evil's full layout plus 3 or 4 major areas. Yeah, this is a really big game, and the runtime reflects that. I managed to finish it in about 10 hours, but if you're smart and don't restart every time you use a little too many bullets on an enemy, you could probably cut that down to 8 or 9. Now, I know a 9-hour RE game could seem like a blade that cuts both ways. After all, no one wants to spend all their time backtracking. Well, 7 is damn competent with pacing as well. There's always a new area to explore, or at least a new twist on an old one, and in this way, 7 made me feel like I did coming back from RE1's guardhouse, but 3 or 4 times during my playthrough. And that just kept happening. I kept getting these brief glimpses of classic Resident Evil formula. It's almost like for the first time an RE developer really understood what made the old games tick and decided to not just implement some type of surface level emulation. It's clear that a great effort went into 2 separate parts of the development process. The first part was making sure this game, despite the radical change in perspective, felt like an honest-to-goodness RE game. And the second was to take those old concepts and improve on them enough to keep from repeating their mistakes. And if you ask me, this was a giant mission fucking accomplished. And after what feels like an hour of rambling, we finally get to the combat. Now, you guys know that RE's never really been about combat in the traditional sense. The idea has always been strategically taking out only the bare minimum amount of enemies and balancing that with the risk of the remaining ones possibly grabbing you during one of your 50 trips through any given area. Well, I can say 7 brings a similar approach, but the ratios are a little off. For the first part of the game, these disgustingly creepy mold things only appear in a part of the house filled with narrow hallways, making combat nearly unavoidable. But an hour or 2 later, you'll be dodging some and killing others just like you're used to. And thanks to a recent YouTube comment that blew my mind with its simple insight, I've noticed something that was there through my entire playthrough, but I just never focused on. Much like the original RE game, 7 doesn't incentivize combat in any video game sort of sense. Meaning the only thing you get from downing enemies is the benefit of them not being a threat anymore. Now, I know this seems like a pretty simple idea, but think about it. For the last 13 years, we've been playing Resident Evil games where killing a foe will often net you ammo or healing items. This wreaks havoc on the idea of balancing a traditional survival horror game, since the general idea is to make combat such a big trade-off that not engaging with it becomes a real strategy. This is one of the many ways in which the game shows that it's the product of a very deep understanding of the originals. Going back to a previous point, I was worried the first-person view would bring typical FPS combat to the game, another point I was very happy to be wrong about. From the start, you were taught that bullets are in short supply, and your character's slow walking speed will keep you from circle strafing your way to victory. To balance this with the urge to fire your weapon as little as possible, there's a block action that, depending on your timing, can greatly reduce incoming damage. After my recent rant on RE3's unreliable dodge move, this was a reassuring addition. The amount of wind-up frames this move has, coupled with the RNG that plays into the type of attacks that an enemy is likely to use, keeps blocking from feeling like a get-out-of-jail-free card, and the cooldown of Ethan coming out of his block makes sure it's not abused. Once you get the hang of choosing your shots wisely and blocking right, the game hits you with another concept from the old guard. Pulling straight from RE2 and 3, some areas that are normally enemy-free can randomly be stalked by one of the bakers, who can momentarily be put down, but you're probably going to want to run and hide instead. I honestly can't even begin to describe the kind of horror that comes from hearing the slight creak of a door opening while you're exploring an area. In these situations, running or hiding will be your best bet, and this can be tense as hell, which I think sums up the entire experience nicely. RE7 as a whole is a horror game first and foremost. Sure, there are action elements sprinkled in, but I think that the balance between the two is what makes it Resident Evil. So many recent first-person horror games choose to forego combat and make every enemy a one-hit kill. For some reason, these types of games, tailor-made for reaction streamers, have often been credited with the survival horror title, and I will never understand why. In my opinion, Resident Evil 7 is the closest thing to survival horror we currently have. It's focused on a limited inventory, high-risk, low-reward combat, puzzle solving, incremental exploration, and strong atmospheric horror, brings it right up to the threshold, but sadly there's one thing preventing it from crossing over into the realm of full-on 90s era survival horror. And here's where I get the negative comments. Alright, let's do this. Survival horror is the sum total of its parts, and if any of those parts are missing, you can't exactly claim that banner. I mean, no one would argue that Super Metroid doesn't have incremental exploration, tough combat, and a huge focus on atmosphere, but we all agree it's not a survival horror game. Well, in that same sense, I think RE7 is missing one small component that keeps it from living up to the title everyone seems to be giving it, and that's the perspective. Yeah, call me a stuck-in-my-ways old-timer, but without the sense of fear that a third-person fixed perspective brings, you just can't have survival horror. So much of the fear found in the old games came from not having the ability to see where that snarl you heard came from, and knowing that the tank controls would make getting by whatever it is a real test of skill. I know a lot of you aren't going to be happy with this, but just know it's not a critique of the game itself. As a horror game, RE7 is absolutely incredible, and like I said, comes closer to survival horror than any other game has. Seriously, there were times during this playthrough when the game kept me so stressed for such a long time that I had to walk away and let myself cool down.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it.
I don't think there's more than 2 or 3 other games that have ever given me that reaction, and on top of the horror, 7 is insanely fun. Not only did I complete the Not a Hero DLC immediately after beating the main game, but I also started a new game and am currently halfway through that. So if you're looking for a glowing review, here it is. I know I've been vague in some of the specifics, but trust me, there's a good reason for that. If you haven't played this game yet, stop this video and grab a copy. Resident Evil 7 is exactly what the series needed and has single-handedly restored my faith in the RE name.
Do I have your attention, boy? You're about to see some wonderful... Oh, fuck!
Finally deciding to ditch the decade-old but still fairly impressive MT framework, Capcom developed an entirely new engine for RE7, resulting in one of the best-looking video games I've ever laid my eyes on. It seems like this engine, or maybe just this specific game's implementation of it, has a large focus on lighting and specular effects. These two categories tend to account for the most visually impressive virtual environments in my opinion, so it's no surprise that I was stuck into this world from the word go. The second I was able to explore the Baker home, I was blown away by little things like realistic reflections and the convincing-looking wet surfaces. There's also a lot of camera-like effects going on, like forced depth of field and chromatic aberrations. All of this comes together to form one of the most immersive environments you can imagine, but even in such an impressive package, there are a few flaws to talk about. The engine seems to favor using post-processing and lighting effects to make textures look a little more realistic than they actually are, so getting close to some 3D models can kind of ruin that effect. Of course, this isn't a big deal, but the interesting thing is, this wouldn't even stick out if the game didn't look so damn photorealistic otherwise. There are a few instances where this kind of dissonance can happen. For example, while running away from enemies, you might want to shut a door behind you to make sure you're safe, but seeing these guys clip through them can really clash with the realistic feeling atmosphere. I also had an issue in the very beginning of the game where a chair got stuck inside Ethan and kept making noise, which gave away my position when hiding. While this was pretty funny and sort of game breaking, I could never get it to happen again, so no harm, no foul. And since we're talking about flaws, I have to bring up how bad some of the faces can look. Jack Baker and this cop seem pretty convincing.
Hey, put that door back! Put that door back up! Wait!
But Marguerite and Mia have a very weird look to them. I think this may stem from a lack of points of articulation in the face and mouth, but I can't really be sure. Of course, this very well may be a personal thing, and that's about all of my complaints. You might have noticed that there aren't many. Well, that's because this game is a marvel to look at. The smallest of complaints that I do have are pretty easy to hand wave away, as this being the first use of such a powerful engine. I imagine the upcoming RE2 remake will see these issues fixed and then some. While this game's atmosphere and graphics are absolutely amazing, there is one thing you can do to make sure they shine as bright as possible, and this will be obvious if you've seen my reviews of the Stalker or Metro games. RE7 gives you the option to get rid of the on-screen HUD, and if you ask me, this is an absolute must. Not having annoying little ammo indicators and action button prompts on screen does wonders for immersing you into this world, but there will be some obvious trade-offs. Items are hidden all over this game, and not having an indicator show up means you'll have to be a better detective and search every nook and cranny. You'll also need to open your inventory to check remaining ammo and health, but that's not exactly a downside for me. I enjoy a nice clean look, and anytime I can get rid of some on-screen clutter, I definitely will. Right about now is typically when we would get real in depth with the ports, but to be honest, there's not a lot to talk about. I'm playing the PC version here, but the next-gen ports are essentially the same exact thing, with a few of the knobs turned down. One really interesting thing to note is that the PS4 version targets 60 frames per second and hits it almost the entire time, even on the baseline non-pro model. That's pretty damn interesting. There is a version on the Switch, but this is an embarrassing attempt. It's essentially just streaming footage from a Japanese server to the Switch, so expect it to be almost unplayable in the States. Of course, there is input lag and compression to deal with if you can play it, so I'd recommend not getting your hopes up. But this shouldn't surprise you, the Switch is a baby console, for babies. Okay, relax, I'm just joking, I promise. Well guys, I have to say that I was completely wrong in my initial impressions of 7. I was sure it was going to be another action game with a few scares, but this turned out to be one of my absolute favorite horror games. It kept me on edge like no other, and gets so close to the original Resident Evil style that you could be forgiven for designating it survival horror. Without a doubt, this has been the most satisfying experience I've had since we left the original entries in this retrospective. If you're a fan of the old RE games, this is a must play for sure. For some of you, I know the first-person perspective can be a bump to get past, but this first-person game is the most faithful Resident Evil experience we've had in years, so I'd say it's definitely worth your time. And I'll leave you with that glowing recommendation since there's a lot more RE games left to cover. Make sure to stick around because we have the much requested Outbreak games coming up next on the list. But until then, I hope to see all of you again right here on the Resident Evil Retrospective. Alright guys, we finally made it to 7. Thanks for sticking around up to this point, and if you like in-depth reviews like this, check out the playlist on screen. If you want to help keep this series rolling, maybe consider backing me on Patreon. Either way, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all again next time.